Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring dystopias. No Shield from the Dead by Gordon R. Dickson. Pick a Crime by Richard Rein Smith. The Inquisitor by Robert Silverberg. Underground Movement by Alan Kim Lang. And There Was Light by Lester del Rey. No Shield from the Dead by Gordon R. Dickson, originally published in If Worlds of Science Fiction, January 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. It was a nice little party, but a bit obvious. Terry Mack saw through it before he had taken 6 steps into the apartment, a light flush staining his high cheekbones. "This is ridiculous," he said. The light chatter ceased. Cocktail glasses were set down on various handy tables and ledges, and all faces in the room turned toward a man in his late 50s who sat propped up invalid-wise on pillows in a chair in a corner of the room. "The comptroller is perspicacious," said the old man, agreeably, waving one hand in a casual manner. "On your way, children." And the people present smiled and nodded. Quite as if it were an ordinary leave-taking, they pushed past Terry Mack and filed out the door. Even the blonde Terry had picked up at the embassy ball and who had brought him here strolled off casually, but in a decidedly less drunken fashion than she had exhibited earlier in the evening. "Sit down," said the old man. Terry Mack did so, gazing searchingly at the skinny frame and white eyebrows in an unsuccessful effort to connect him with something in memory. "This is ridiculous," he repeated. "Really?" The old man smiled benignly. "And why so?" "Why," the situation was so obvious that Terry fumbled, a little at a loss for words. "Obviously you intend some form of coercion, or else you would have come to me along recognized channels. And any thought of coercion is obviously, well, ridiculous." "Why?" "Why, you senile old fool? Don't you know that I'm shielded? Don't you know all government officials from the 5th class up wear complete personal shields that are not only crack-proof, but contain all the necessary elements to support life independently within the shield for more than 20 hours? Don't you know that I'll be missed in 2 hours at the most and tracked down in less than 60 minutes more? Are you crazy?" The old man chuckled, rubbing dry hands together. He said, "I'm shielded too. You can't get at me. And now the room's shielded. You can't get out of it." Terry stared at him. The initial shock was passing. His own statements about the completeness of his protection had brought back confidence, and his natural coolness was returning. "What do you want?" he asked, eyeing the other narrowly. "Pleasure of your company," said the old man. "There are some very strong connections between us. Yes, very strong. We must get to know each other personally." It occurred to Terry that he had misinterpreted the situation. Relief came, mixed with a certain amount of chagrin at the way in which he allowed himself to show alarm. He had looked ridiculous. He leaned back in the chair and allowed a note of official hauteur and annoyance to creep into his voice. "I see," he said. "You want something." The old man nodded energetically. "I do. Indeed I do." "And you think you have some kind of a bargaining tool that is useful that might not be so if it became known to official channels?" "Well," said the old man cautiously. "Don't waste my time," interrupted Terry harshly. "I'm not an ordinary politician. No man who works his way up to the 5th level of the government is. I didn't get to where I am today by pussyfooting around, and I haven't the leisure to spend on people who do. Now what do you want?" The other cackled. "Now what do you think?" he said, putting one finger to his nose cunningly. You are old, Terry said, and therefore cautious. Consequently, you would not risk trying to force something from me, but are almost certainly trying to sell me something. Now what do I want? Not the usual things, certainly. Within my position I have all the material things a man could want, and within my shield I enjoy complete immunity. No one but the Central Bureau itself can crack this shield, and no one but they can prevent the conditioned reflex that stops my heart if for some reason the shield should be broached. I have a hold on every man beneath me that prevents him from knifing me in the back. There could be only one thing that I want that you could give me. He leaned forward, staring into the deep pouched eyes. And that is a means of getting at the man above me. Am I right? No, said the old man. Terry stiffened. No? He echoed in angry incredulity. Their eyes locked. For a long time they held, and at last Terry looked away. The old man sighed, sipped noisily from a drink on the table beside his chair. Wait, said Terry. To his own surprise, his voice was eager, even a little timorous in his hopefulness. Wait, I've got it. There will be a test. There's always a test every time a man moves up. His superiors watch him when he doesn't suspect it. It will be that way for me when I am ready for the 4th level. And you have some kind of advance information. You know what the test will be. Maybe you know the man who will administer it. You want to sell me this information. The other said nothing. Well, Terry spread his hands openly. I am interested. I'll buy. What do you want? Money? A favour? Protection? No. No? Terry shouted, starting up from his chair. What do you mean by no? Can't you say anything but no? A rage possessed him. He flung himself forward 2 furious steps to stand threateningly over the aged figure. You doddering idiot! Say what you want, and quickly. My 2 hours are nearly up. I'll be missed. They'll be here in a few minutes. The Bureau guards. They'll crack the room shield. They'll rescue me, and they'll take you into custody, to be questioned, to be executed, at my order. Do you understand? Your life depends on me. After a little, the old man chuckled again. Yes, he muttered, in a high-pitched old voice. That's the way it'll be. Terry stared at him. You don't seem to understand. You're going to die. Oh, yes, said the old man, nodding his head indulgently. I'll die. But I'm an old man. I'll die anyway in a year or so, maybe in a day or so. But for you, for a young man like you, the up-and-coming young governmental with everything to lose, he leered slyly at Terry, your death won't be so easy for you to take. I die? Echoed Terry, stupefied. But I'm not going to die. They're coming to rescue me. Oh, are they? Said the old man, ironically. Of course, said Terry. Of course, why shouldn't they? The old man winked one faded eye portentously. Fine young man, he said. Up-and-coming young man. Brilliant. Never a fault for the people who trample on the way up the ladder. Dear me, no. What do you mean? Said Terry. The old eyes, looking up suddenly, pierced him. Do you remember Kilaren? Kilaren? Kilaren, recited the old man, as if quoting from a newspaper. The beautiful young secretary of a provincial governor whose lecherous and unnatural pursuit drove her to suicide, so that one day to escape the governor she jumped or fell from a high window, and the people of the province, who had for a long time heard ugly stories and rumours, finally mobbed the office and lynched the governor, hanging him from the same window from which the girl had jumped. They said that even the fall had not spoiled her beauty, but that was probably false. The old man's words dwindled away into silence. If so, what of it? Said Terry. What's that to do with me? Why, you were there. You were the governor's aide, and when the mob had gone home and feeling had slackened off, you stepped into the gap and seized up the remains of government. handling matters so skillfully that you were immediately promoted to an underpost at Government City." "What of it?" "Why, it was all your doing," replied the other in a mildly reproving voice. "The rumours, the stories, the mob, even the suicide. Poor Kilaran, a pitiful pawn in your ruthless game to eliminate the governor in your mad dash up the ladder." "I never touched her," cried Terry, his voice cracking. "I swear it." "Who said you did? The type of mind that stoops to murder would never have gotten you this far. But you were the one who hired her, knowing the governor's tendencies. You were the one that gave her work, that kept her, night after night, alone with the man. You preyed upon her fear of losing her job. You threw the sin in her face after she had committed it. You told her what she might have been, and what she was, and what she would be. You broke her, day after day. In the sterile privacy of the office you reviled her, scorned her, brought her to believe that she was what she was not, a creature of filth and dishonour. You blocked off all avenues of escape but the one that led through one high window. You killed her." "No." "Yes." Terry brought his quivering hands together and clenched them in his lap. He stared at the old man. "Who are you?" "I was a friend of hers. We lived in the same hotel apartment. She had no family. I believe you knew that when you hired her." "I see," said Terry. He drew a long, deep, shuddering breath and leaned back in the chair. "So that's the story," he said, his voice strengthening. "I might have known it. Blackmail. There are always fools that want to try and blackmail." "No," said the old man. "Not blackmail, comptroller. I want your life." Terry laughed shortly, contemptuously. "No knowledge that you have can threaten my life." "There will come," said the old man, leaning wearily back against his cushions. "As you said, the bureau guards will come, and I think I shall kill myself when I hear them starting to crack the shield around this room. They will come in and find you with a dead man. What will you tell them, Terry?" "Tell them? Anything I choose. They won't question me." "No, the guards won't, but the bureau will. How can they raise a man to the 4th level when there is a 2-hour mystery in his background? They will want to know what you were doing here." "I was kidnapped," said Terry. "By whom? Can you prove it? And why?" "I've been held a prisoner here." "By a dead man? No, no, Terry. The circumstances are suspicious. You walk away from the embassy under your own power. You disappear, and are found in a shielded room with a man who has committed suicide. This must be explained, and in the end you will have to tell them the truth." "And what if I do?" said Terry truculently. "But the truth is so fantastic, Terry, so uncheckable. I am dead, and I am the only one who could have supported your story. These people who were here when you came in are common actors. They have no idea why I wanted you decoyed here. These are my rooms, and there is no obvious connection between me and the dead Kilaran, and perhaps I will decide to live just long enough to denounce you as a traitor when they enter." Ashen-faced Terry stared. "The Bureau will have to question you. They will clamp a block on your mind so that you can't operate the reflex that stops your heart, and they will question you over and over again because the Bureau cannot afford to take chances. You will go into a private hell of your own, Terry Mack. You will tell the story of your own evil to that girl over and over again, pleading to be believed, and they will not believe you. And in the end, they will kill you, just to be on the safe side, because, you see, you might have been doing something traitorous in these 2 shielded hours." Terry's head bobbed limply, like a drunken man's. He made one last effort. "Why?" he said. "Why do you do this? Your life. for a girl who was no connection to you." The old man folded his hands. "I was a little like your governor," he said. "We all have our sins. I loved Gilaren, and the shock of her death wrecked my health." He cocked his head suddenly on one side. "Listen," he said. From beyond the closed door of the room, a high-pitched humming was barely audible. It grew in volume, going up the scale. Terry leaped to his feet, and for the space of a couple of seconds he lunged first this way then that, like a wild animal beating against its trap. Then, as if all will had last gone out of him, he stopped in the middle of a room and closed his eyes. For a fraction of a moment he stood there, before a faint convulsion seized him and he fell. With a faint smile on his face, the old man reached out to a hidden switch and cut the shield about the room. Uniformed guards tumbled through the door to pull up in dismay at the sight of the body on the floor. "I'm sorry," said the old man. "I must have turned the shield on by mistake. I was trying to signal someone. The comptroller seems to have had a heart attack."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Pick a Crime by Richard Rein Smith, writing as Richard R. Smith. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, May 1958. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The girl was tall, wide-eyed and brunette. She had the right curves in the right places, and would have been beautiful if her nose had been smaller, if her mouth had been larger, and if her hair had been wavy instead of straight. "Hank said you wanted to see me," she said when she stopped beside Joe's table. "Yeah," Joe nodded at the other chair. "Have a seat." He reached into a pocket, withdrew 5 $10 bills and handed them to her. "I want you to do a job for me. It'll only take a few minutes." The girl counted the money, then placed it in her purse. Joe noticed a small counterfeit detector inside the purse before she closed it. "What's the job?" "I'll tell you later." He gulped the remainder of his drink, almost pouring it down his throat. "Hey, you're trying to make yourself sick?" "Not sick, drunk. Been trying to get drunk all afternoon." As the liquor settled in his stomach, he waited for the warm glow. But the glow didn't come. The bartender had watered his drink again. "Trying to get drunk?" the girl inquired. "Are you crazy?" "No, it's simple. If I get drunk, I can join the AAA and get free room and board for a month while they give me a treatment." It was easy enough to understand, he reflected, but a lot harder to do. The CPA robot bartenders saw to it that anyone got high if they wanted, but comparatively few got drunk. Each bartender could not only mix drinks, but could also judge by a man's actions and speech when he was on the verge of drunkenness. At the proper time, since drunkenness was illegal, a bartender always watered the drinks. Joe had tried dozens of times in dozens of bars to outsmart them, but had always failed, and in all of New York's millions there had been only 100 cases of intoxication during the previous years. The girl laughed. "If you're that hard up, I don't know if I should take this 50 or not. Why don't you go out and get a job like everyone else?" As an answer, Joe handed her his CPA ID card. She grunted when she saw the large letters that indicated the owner had dangerous criminal tendencies. When she handed the card back, Joe fought an impulse to tear it to pieces. He'd done that once, and gone through a mountain of red tape to get another. Everyone was required by law to carry a CPA ID card and show it upon a request. "I'm sorry," the girl said. "I didn't know you were a DCT." "And who'll hire a guy with criminal tendencies? You know the score. When you try to get a job, they ask to see your ID before they even tell you if there's an opening or not. If your CPA ID says you're a DCT, you're SOL, and they'll tell you there's no openings. Oh, I've had several jobs. Jobs like all DCTs get. I've been a garbage man, street cleaner, ditch digger. On the other side of the room, the jukebox came to life with a roar, and a group of teenagers scrambled to the dance floor. Feeling safe from hidden microphones because of the uproar, he leaned across the table and whispered in the girl's ear, "That's what I want to hire you for. I want you to help me commit a crime. If I get convicted of a crime, I'll be able to get a good job." The girl's lips formed a bright red circle. "Say, you really got big plans, don't you?" He smiled at her admiration. It was something big to plan a crime. A civilization weary of murder, robbery, kidnapping, counterfeiting, blackmail, rape, arson, and drunkenness had originated the CPA, Crime Prevention Association. There were no longer any prisons. CPA officials had declared loudly and emphatically that their job was to prevent crime, not punish it. And prevent it they did, with thousands of ingenious crime prevention devices and methods. They had made crime almost impossible, and during the previous year, only a few hundred men in the whole country had been convicted of criminal acts. No crime was ever punished. If a man was smart enough to kill someone, for instance, he wasn't sent to prison to be punished. He wasn't punished at all. Instead, he was sent to a hospital where all criminal tendencies were removed from his mind by psychologists, shock treatments, encephalographic devices, a form of prefrontal lobotomy, and a dozen other methods. An expensive operation, but since there were few criminals, only 10 in New York during the past year, any city could afford the CPA hospitals. The CPA system was, actually, cheaper than previous methods because it did away with the damage caused by countless crimes, did away with prisons and their guards, large police forces, squad cars and weapons. And ironically, a man who did commit a crime was a sort of hero. He was hero to the millions of men and women who had suppressed impulses to kill someone, beat their mates, get drunk or kick a dog. Not only a hero, but because of the CPA treatment, he was, when he left one of the CPA hospitals, a thoroughly honest and hard-working individual, a man who could be trusted with any responsibility, any amount of money, and therefore an X. A convicted criminal who received the treatment was commonly called an X because he was, in the strictest sense of the word, an ex-criminal. An X was always offered the best jobs. "Well," the girl said, "I'm honoured. Really. But I got a date at 10. Let's get it over with. You said it'd only take a few minutes." "Okay, let's go." The girl followed him across a room, around tables, through a door, down a hall, through a back door, and into the alley. She followed him up the dark alley until he turned suddenly and ripped her blouse and skirt. He surprised her completely, but when she recovered, she backed away, her body poised like a wrestler's. "What's the big idea?" "Scream," Joe said. "Scream as loud as you can, and when the cops get here, tell them I tried to rape you." The plan was perfect, he told himself. Attempted rape was one of the few things that was a crime merely because a man attempted it. A crime because it theoretically inflicted psychological injury upon the intended victim, and because millions of women voters had voted it a crime. On the other hand, attempted murder, robbery, kidnapping, etc., they were not crimes. They weren't crimes because the DCT didn't complete the act, and if it didn't complete the act, that meant simply that the CPA had once again functioned properly. The girl shook her head vigorously. "Sorry, buddy, can't help you that way. Why didn't you tell me what you wanted?" "What's the matter?" Joe complained. "I'm not asking you to do anything wrong." "You stupid jerk. What do you think this is, the Middle Ages? Don't you know almost every woman knows how to defend herself? I'm a sergeant in a WSDA." Joe groaned. The WSDA, Women's Self-Defense Association, a branch of the CPA. The WSDA gave free instruction in judo and jiu-jitsu, even developed new techniques of wrestling and instructed only women in those new techniques. The girl was still shaking her head. "Can't do it, buddy. I'd lose my rank if you were convicted of—" "Do I have to make you scream?" Joe inquired tiredly, and advanced toward the girl. "And that rank carries a lot of weight. Hey, stop it!" Joe discovered to his dismay that the girl was telling the truth when she said she was a sergeant in the WSDA. He felt her hand on his body, and in the time it takes to blink twice, he was flying through the air. The alley's concrete floor was hard. It had always been hard, but he became acutely aware of its lack of resiliency when his head struck it. There was a wonderful moment while the world was filled with beautiful stars and streaks of lightning through which he heard distant police sirens. But the wonderful moment didn't last long, and darkness closed in on him. When he awoke, a rough voice was saying, "Okay, snap out of it." He opened his eyes and recognized the police commissioner's office. It would be hard not to recognize. The room was large, devoid of furniture except for a desk and chairs, but the walls were lined with the controls of television screens, electronic calculators, and 100 other machines that formed New York's mechanical police force. Commissioner Hendricks was a remarkable character. There was something wrong with his glands, and he was a huge, greasy bulk of a man, with bushy eyebrows and a double chin. His steel-grey eyes showed something of his intelligence, and he would have gone far in politics if fate hadn't made him so ugly, for more than half the voters who elected men to high political positions were women. Anyone who knew Hendricks well liked him, for he was a friendly, likeable person. But the millions of women voters who saw his face on posters and on the TV screens saw only the ugly face and heard only the harsh voice. The President of the United States was a capable man, but also a very handsome one, and the fact that a man who looked something like a bulldog had been elected as New York Police Commissioner was a credit to Hendricks and millions of women voters. "Where's the girl?" Joe asked. "I processed her while you were out cold. She left. Joe, you—" "Okay," Joe said. "I'll save you the trouble. I admit it. Attempted rape. I confess." Hendricks smiled. "Sorry, Joe. You missed the boat again." He reached out and turned a dial on his desktop. "We had a microphone hidden in that alley. We have a lot of microphones hidden in a lot of alleys. You'll be surprised at the number of conspiracies that take place in alleys." Joe listened numbly to his voice as it came from one of the hundreds of machines on the wall. "Scream! Scream as loud as you can, and when the cops get here, tell them I tried to rape you." And then the girl's voice. "Sorry, buddy, can't help." He waved his hand. "Okay, shut it off. I confess to conspiracy." Hendricks rose from behind the desk, walked leisurely to where Joe was slouched in a chair. "Give me your CPA ID." Joe handed him the card with trembling fingers. He felt as if the world had collapsed beneath him. Conspiracy to commit a crime wasn't a crime. Anyone could conspire, and if the conspirators were prevented from committing a crime, then that meant the CPA had functioned properly yet once again. That meant the CPA had once again prevented crime, and the CPA didn't punish crimes or attempted crimes, and it didn't attempt to prevent crimes by punishment. If it did, that would be the violation of the new civil rights. Hendricks crossed the room, deposited the card in a slot, and punched a button. The machine hummed, and a new card appeared. When Hendricks handed him the new card, Joe saw that the words "dangerous criminal tendencies" were now in red and larger than before. And in slightly smaller print, the ID card stated that the owner was a DCT first class. "You've graduated," Hendricks said coldly. "You guys never learn, do you? Now you're a DCT first class instead of a second class. You know what that means?" Hendricks leaned closer until Joe could feel his breath on his face. "That means your case history will be turned over to the newspapers. You'll be the hobby of thousands of amateur cops. You know how it works. It's like this. The Joneses are sitting around tomorrow night, and they're bored. Then Mr. Jones says, "Let's go watch this Joe Harper." So they look up your record. Amateur cops always keep records of first classes in scrapbooks, and they see that you stop frequently at Walt's Tavern. So they go there, and they sit and drink and watch you, trying not to let you know they're watching you. They watch you all night, just hoping you'll do something exciting, like trying to kill someone, so they can be the first ones to yell, "Police!" They'll watch you because it's exciting to be an amateur cop, and if they ever did prevent you from committing a crime, they'd get a nice reward and they'd be famous. "Lay off," Joe said. "I've got a headache. That girl—" Hendricks leaned even closer and glared. "You listen, Joe. This is interesting. You see, it doesn't stop with Mr. and Mrs. Jones. There's thousands of people like them. Years ago, they got their kicks from reading about guys like you, but these days things are dull because it's rare when anyone commits a crime. So every time you walk down the street, there'll be at least a dozen of them following you, and no matter where you go, you can bet there'll be some of them sitting next to you, standing next to you. During the day, they'll take your picture with their spy cameras that look like buttons on their coats. At night, they'll peep at you through your keyhole. Your neighbours across the street will watch you through binoculars and—" "Lay off!" Joe squirmed in the chair. He'd been lectured by Hendricks before, and was always an unpleasant experience. The huge man was like a talking machine once he got started, a machine that couldn't be stopped. "And the kids are the worst," Hendricks continued. "They have junior CPA clubs. They keep records of hoodlums like you in little cardboard boxes. They'll stare at you on the street and stare at you through restaurant windows while you're eating meals. They'll follow you in public restrooms and watch you out of the corners of their eyes while they wash their little hands, and almost every day when you look back, you'll see a dozen freckled-faced little boys following you half a block behind, giggling and gaping at you. They'll follow you until the day you die, because you're a freak." Joe couldn't stand the breath in his face any longer. He rose and paced the floor. "And it doesn't end there, Joe. It goes on and on. You'll be the object of every do-gooder and parlour psychologist. Strangers will stop you on the street and say, 'I'd like to help you, friend.' Then they'll ask you queer questions like, 'Did your father reject you when you were a child? Do you like girls? How does it feel to be a DCT first class?' And then there'll be strangers who hate DCTs. They'll stop you on the street and insult you, call you names, spit on you, and—" "Okay, goddammit, stop it!" Hendricks stopped, wiped the sweat from his face with a handkerchief and lit a cigarette. "I'm doing you a favour, Joe. I'm trying to explain something you're too dumb to realize by yourself. We've taught everyone to hate crime and criminals, to hate them as nothing has ever been hated before. Today a criminal is a freak, an alien. Your life will be a living hell if you don't leave New York. You should go to some small town where there aren't many people, or be a hermit, or go to Iceland, or—" Joe eyed the huge man suspiciously. "Favour, did you say? The day you do me a favour." Hendricks shrugged his shoulders negligently. "Not entirely a favour. I want to get rid of you. Usually I come up here and sit around and read books, but guys like you are a nuisance and take up my time." "I couldn't leave if I wanted to," Joe said. "I'm flat broke. Thanks to your CPA system, a DCT can't get a decent job." Hendricks reached into a pocket, withdrew several bills and extended them. "I'll loan you some money. You can sign an INU and pay me back a little at a time." Joe waved the money away. "Listen, why don't you do a favour? Why don't you frame me? If I'm such a nuisance, pin a crime on me, any crime." "Can't do it. Convicting a man of a crime he didn't commit is a violation of civil rights and a crime in itself." "Why don't you take the free psycho treatment? A man doesn't have to be a DCT. With the free treatment, psychologists can remove all your criminal tendencies and—" "Go to those head shrinkers?" Hendricks shrugged again. "Have it your way." Joe laughed. "If your damned CPA is so all-powerful, why can't you make me go?" violation of civil rights. Damn it, there must be some way you can help me. We both want the same thing. We both want to see me convicted of a crime. How can I help you without committing a crime myself? Hendricks walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and removed a small black book. See this? It contains names and addresses of all the people in New York who aren't properly protected. Every week we find people who aren't protected, probably blind spots in our protection devices. As soon as we find them, we take steps to install anti-robbery devices, but this is a big city, and sometimes it takes days to get the work done. In the meantime, any one of these people could be robbed. But what can I do? I can't hold this book in front of your nose and say, "Here, Joe, pick a name and go out and rob him." He laughed nervously. If I did that, I'd be committing a crime myself. He placed the book on the desktop, took a handkerchief from a pocket again, and wiped sweat from his face. "Excuse me a minute, I'm dying of thirst. There's a water cooler in the next room." Joe stared at the door to the adjoining office as it closed behind the big man. Hendricks was, unbelievably, offering him a victim, offering him a crime. Almost running to the desk, Joe opened the book, selected a name and address, and memorized it. John Gralewski, apartment 204, 2141, Orange Street. When Hendricks came back, Joe said, "Thanks." "Huh? Thanks for what? I didn't do anything." When Joe reached the street, he hurried towards the nearest subway. As a child, he had been frightened of the dark. As a man, he wasn't afraid of the dark itself, but the darkened city always made him feel ill at ease. The uneasiness was, more than anything else, caused by his own imagination. He hated the CPA, and at night he couldn't shrug the feeling that the CPA lurked in every shadow, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Imagination or not, the CPA was almost everywhere a person went. 24 hours a day, millions of microphones hidden in taverns, alleys, restaurants, subways, and every other place imaginable waited for someone to say the wrong thing. Everything the microphones picked up was routed to the CPA brain, a monster electronic calculator. If the words "let's see a movie" were received in the brain, they were discarded. But if the words "let's roll this guy" were received, the message was traced and a police helicopter would be at the scene in 2 minutes. And scattered all over the city were not only hidden microphones, but hidden television cameras that relayed visual messages to the brain, and hidden machines that could detect a knife or a gun in someone's pocket at 40 yards. Every place of business, from the largest bank to the smallest grocery store, was absolutely impenetrable. No one had even tried to rob a place of business for years. Arson was next to impossible because of the heat detectors, devices placed in every building that could detect, radar-like, any intensity of heat above that caused by a cigarette lighter. Chemical research had made poisoning someone an impossibility. There were no drugs containing poison, and while an ant poison might kill ants, no concentrated amount of it could kill a human. The FBI had always been a powerful organization, but under the supervision of the CPA, it was a scientific colossus, and to think of kidnapping someone or to contemplate the use of narcotics was pointless. A counterfeiter's career was always short-lived. Every place of business and millions of individuals had small counterfeit detectors that could spot a fake and report it directly to the brain. And the percentage of crimes had dwindled even more with the appearance of the robot police officers. Many a criminal in the past had gambled that he could outshoot a pursuing policeman. But the robots were different. They weren't flesh and blood. Bullets bounced off them, and their aim was infallible. It was like a fantastic dream come true, only the dream wasn't fantastic anymore. With the huge atomic power plants scattered across the country and supplying endless electrical power at ridiculously low prices, no endeavor that required power was fantastic. The power required to operate the CPA devices cost each taxpayer an average of $4 a year, and the invention, development, and manufacture of devices had cost even less. and the CPA had attacked crime through society itself, striking at the individual. In every city there were neon signs that blinked subliminally with the statement, "Crime is filth." Listening to a radio or watching television, if a person heard station identification, he invariably heard or saw, just below perception, the words, "Crime is filth." If he went for a walk or a ride, he saw the endless subliminal posters declaring, "Crime is filth." And if he read a magazine or newspaper, he always found in those little dead spaces when editor couldn't fit anything else, the below perception words, "Crime is filth." It was monotonous, and after a while a person looked at the words and heard them without thinking about them, and they were imprinted on his subconscious over and over, year after year, until he knew that crime was the same as filth, and that criminals were filthy things. Except men like Joe Harper, no system is perfect. Along with thousands of other DCTs, Joe refused to believe it, and when he reached apartment 204 at 2141 Orange Street, he felt as if he'd inherited a gold mine. The hall was dimly lit, but when he stood before the door number 204, he could see that the wall on either side of it was new. That is, instead of being covered with dust, dirt and stains as the other walls were, it was clean. The building was an old one, the hall was wide, and the owner had obviously constructed a wall across the hall, creating another room. If the owner had reported the new room as required by law, it would have been wired with CPA burglar-proof devices, but evidently he didn't want to pay for installation. When Joe entered the cubbyhole, he had to stand to one side in order to close the door behind him. The place was barely large enough for bed, chair and bureau. It was a place where a man could fall down at night and sleep, but where no normal man could live day after day. Fearing that someone might detect him before he actually committed the crime, Joe hurried to the bureau and searched it. He broke out in a sweat when he found nothing but underwear and old magazines. If he stole underwear and magazines, it would still be a crime, but the newspapers would splash satirical headlines. Instead of being respected as a successful criminal, he would be ridiculed. He stopped sweating when he found a watch under a pile of underwear. The crystal was broken, one hand was missing, and it wouldn't run. But perfection itself, engraved on the back was the inscription, "To John with love." This trial will be a clean-cut one. It will be easy for the CPA to prove ownership and that a crime had been committed. Chuckling with joy, he opened the window and shouted, "Thief! Police! Help!" He waited a few seconds and then ran. When he reached the street, a police helicopter landed next to him. Strong metal arms seized him. Cameras clicked and recorded the damning evidence. When Joe was securely handcuffed to a seat inside the helicopter, the metal police officers rang doorbells. There was a reward for anyone reported a crime, but no one admitted shouting the warning. He was having a nightmare when he heard the voice, "Hey, wake up, hey!" He opened his eyes, saw Hendrik's ugly face, and thought for a minute he was still having the nightmare. "I just saw your doctor," Hendrik said. "He says your treatment is over. You can go home now. I thought I'd give you a lift." As Joe dressed, he searched his mind and tried to find some difference. During the treatment, he had been unconscious or drugged, unable to think. Now he could think clearly, but he could find no difference in himself. He felt more relaxed than he'd ever felt before, but that could be an after-effect of all the sedatives he'd been given, and he noticed when he looked in the mirror he was paler. The treatment had taken months, and he had, between operations, been locked in his room. Hendricks was standing by the window. Joe stared at the massive back. Deliberately goading his mind, he discovered the biggest change. Before, the mere sight of the man had aroused an intense hatred. Now, even when he tried, he succeeded in arousing only a mild hatred. They had toned down his capacity to hate, but not done away with it altogether. "Come here and take a look at your public," said Hendricks. Joe went to the window. 3 stories below, a large crowd had gathered on the hospital steps. A band, photographers, television trucks, cameramen, and autograph hunters. He'd waited a long time for this day. But now, another change in him. He put the emotion into words. "I don't feel like a hero. Funny, but I don't." "Hero!" Hendricks laughed, and with his powerful lungs it sounded like a bull snorting. "You think a successful criminal is a hero? You stupid!" He laughed again and waved a hand at the crowd below them. "You think those people are down there because they admire what you did? They're down there waiting for you because they're curious, because they're glad the CPA caught you, and because they're glad you're an ex. You're an ex-criminal now, and because of your treatment, you'll never be able to commit another crime as long as you live. And that's the kind of guy they admire, so they want to see you, shake your hand, and get your autograph." Joe didn't understand Hendricks completely, but the part he did understand, he didn't believe. A crowd was waiting for him. He could see the people with his own eyes. When he left the hospital, they'd cheer and shout and ask for his autograph. If he wasn't a hero, what was he? It took half an hour to get through the crowd. Cameras clicked all around him. 100 kids asked for his autograph. Everyone talked at once and cheered, smiled, laughed, patted him on the back, and cheered some more. Only one thing confused him during all the excitement. A white-haired old lady with tears in her eyes said, "Thank heaven it was only a watch. Thank heaven you didn't kill someone. God bless you, son." And then the old lady had handed him a box of fudge and left him in total confusion. What she had said didn't make sense. If he had killed someone rather than stealing a watch, he would be even more of a hero, and the crowd would have cheered even louder. He knew he had stood outside the CPA hospitals many times, and the crowds always cheered louder when an ex-murderer came out. In Hendricks' robot-chauffeured car, he ate the fudge and consoled himself with the thought, "People are funny. Who can understand them?" Feeling happy for one of the few times in his life, he turned toward Hendricks and said, "Thanks for what you did. It turned out great. I'll be able to get a good job now." "That's why I met you at the hospital," Hendricks said. "I want to explain some things. I've known you for a long time, and I know you're spectacularly dumb. You can't figure out some things for yourself, and I don't want you walking around the rest of your life thinking I did you a favor." Joe frowned. Few men had ever done him a favor, and he had rarely thanked anyone for anything. And now, after thanking the man who'd done him the biggest favor of all, the man was denying it. "You robbed Groluski's apartment," Hendricks said. "Groluski is a CPA employee, and he doesn't live in the apartment you robbed. The CPA pays the rent for that one, and he lives in another. We have a lot of places like that. You see, it gives us a way to get rid of saps like you before they do real damage. We use it as a last resort when a DCT first class won't take the free psycho treatment or... well, it's still a favor." Hendricks' face hardened. "Favor? You wouldn't know a favor if you stumbled over one. I did it because it's standard procedure for your type of case. Anyone can, free of charge, have treatment by the best psychologist. Any DCT can stop being a DCT by simply asking for the treatment and taking it. But you wouldn't do that. You wanted to commit a crime, get caught and be a hero, an ex." The car passed one of the CPA playgrounds. Boys and girls of all ages were laughing, squealing with joy as they played games designed by CPA psychologists to relieve tension. And, despite the treatment, Joe shuddered when he saw the psychologist standing to one side, quietly watching the children. The whole world was filled with CPA employees and volunteer workers. Everywhere you went, it was there, quietly watching you and analysing you. And if you showed criminal tendencies, it watched you even more closely and analysed you even more deeply until it took you apart and put you back together again the way it wanted you to be. Being an X, you'll get the kind of job you always wanted, Hendricks continued. You'll get a good-paying job, but you'll work for it. You'll work 8 hours a day, work harder than you ever worked before in your life, because every time you start to loaf, a voice in your head is going to say, work, work. X's always get good jobs because employers know they're good workers. But during these next few days, you'll discover what being an X is like. You see, Joe, the treatment can't possibly take all the criminal tendencies out of a man. So the treatment does the next best thing. You'll find a set of laws written in your mind. You might want to break one now and then, but you won't be able. I'll give you an illustration. Joe's face reddened as Hendricks proceeded to call him a series of names. He wanted to smash the fat, grinning face, but the muscles in his arms froze before it moved an inch. And worse than that, a brief pain ripped through his skull, a pain so intense that, had it lasted a second longer, he would have screamed in agony. And above the pain, a voice whispered in his head, "Unlawful to strike someone except in self-defense." He opened his mouth to tell Hendricks exactly what he thought of him, the CPA, the whole world, but the words stayed in his throat, the pain returned, and the mental voice whispered, "Unlawful to curse." He had never heard how the treatment prevented an X from committing a crime, and now that he knew, it didn't seem fair. He decided to tell the whole story to the newspapers as soon as he could, and as soon as that decision formed in his mind, his body froze, the pain returned, and the voice, "Unlawful to divulge CPA procedure." "See what I mean?" Hendricks asked. "A century ago, you would have been locked in a prison and taxpayers' money would have supported you until the day you died. With the CPA system, you return to society, a useful citizen, unable to commit the smallest crime. And you've got a big hand in your dirty little mind that's going to slap it every time you get the wrong kind of thought. It'll keep slapping you until you learn. It might take weeks, months, or years, but you'll learn sooner or later to not even think about doing anything wrong." He lit a cigarette and blew a smoke ring at the car's plush ceiling. "It's a great system, isn't it, Joe? A true democracy. Even a jerk like you is free to do what he wants, as long as it's legal." "I think it's a lousy, filthy system." Joe's head was still tingling with pain and he felt suffocated. The CPA was everywhere, only now it was also inside his head, telling him he couldn't do this, couldn't do that. All his life it had been telling him he couldn't do things he wanted to do, and now... Hendricks laughed. "You'll change your opinion. We live in a clean, wonderful world, Joe. A world of happy, healthy people. Except for freaks like yourself. Criminals are... Let me out!" Joe grabbed at the door and was on the sidewalk, slamming the door behind him before the car stopped completely. He stared at the car as it pulled away from the curb and glided into the stream of traffic again. He realized he was a prisoner inside his own body, made a prisoner by a world that hated him back. He wanted to spit his content, but the increasingly familiar pain and voice prevented him. It was unlawful to spit on a sidewalk.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
The Inquisitor by Robert Silverberg, writing as Randall Garrett. Originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, December 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. It wasn't that Kroll enjoyed watching the traitors broken in body and spirit, but why did they keep insisting they were innocent? When Conway Kroll reached his office that morning, there were 3 prisoners waiting to be interrogated. He smiled coldly at the sight of them, standing in the large bare room awaiting their fate. "Good morning," he said with steely politeness. "My name is Kroll. It is my job to conduct the interrogation to which you three will be subjected today." One of the three, a tall, youthful-looking man, glared up at him bitterly. "Interrogation? Torture, you mean?" Kroll brought his eyes to rest on the man who had spoken slowly, almost scornfully. "You have the wrong idea completely, my friend. It is necessary to persuade you to divulge certain facts. The state requires it of you. If you refuse," he gestured sadly, "we must compel you. But you are all so determined to make things hard for us. I don't want to hurt you, you know." "But you will hurt us," said another of the prisoners. She was a girl, no more than 20, slim and dark-haired. Even in the dreary prison garb, thought Kroll, she retained her beauty. "You're going to torture us." Kroll shrugged. "I repeat, I don't want to." He looked at his watch. "Come, we are wasting time, and the Inquisitor is waiting. Miss Horniman, you must be first." The girl shrank back behind the bitter-eyed young man. The third prisoner, a resigned-looking, balding man of 50 or so, did not change his expression. "Take me first," the man said. "Leave her alone." Again Kroll shrugged. "The Inquisitor would like Miss Horniman first, Mr. Leslie. This is the preferred order, and this is the order that it will be." A guard stepped forward and shoved the sobbing girl up and ahead toward the door. The man named Leslie clashed his manacles impotently together and spat. "Butchers! Torturers!" "Please, Mr. Leslie," Kroll said gently, a pained expression on his face. "You make our job even harder than it is." He followed the girl into the adjoining room where the Inquisitor was waiting. The interrogation chamber was an immense rectangular room with concrete floor and bleak white walls, in the center of which stood the Inquisitor. "Good morning, Kroll," the Inquisitor said. Its metallic voice rattled and boomed in the big room. In the depths of the machine, relays clicked and hummed. Kroll bowed to it, and the Inquisitor responded with a gesture of a prolonged metal arm. "The first prisoner, Kroll." "Miss Florence Horniman," Kroll said, "accused of treason against the state, denies charge." "How do you plead?" the machine asked coldly. "Not guilty," stammered the girl. Two huge metal arms extended from the Inquisitor's sides and folded around her. They drew her across the room to the bosom of the robot. "Feed in the data, Kroll." At the signal, Kroll slipped in the tape on the girl. A moment passed while the Inquisitor digested the data, and then, "The plea of not guilty is rejected as invalid." "You can't just do that," the girl said. "That's my plea." "Not valid in view of the evidence," said the Inquisitor. Kroll smiled distantly. He had seen this scene repeated over and over, almost every day for the 10 years he had held the post. He wrapped his blue and gold interrogator's cloak around himself impressively and stepped forward. "You are accused of treason against the state," Kroll said sonorously. "But it is my duty to inform you that your sentence may be mitigated upon your delivering us certain information about leaders of your movement, future plans, location of your party cell, and so forth." Florence Horniman's eyes flashed brightly. "I won't tell you anything." "Perhaps I did not make myself clear," Kroll said. He repeated his offer. "The answer is still no." Kroll sighed. "Very well," he said. A third hand slid from the Inquisitor's body, and a needle-thin finger traced a line down the girl's bare arm. A bloody trickle appeared. She began to sob again. Kroll stepped closer and lifted her head. "Why must you hold out?" he asked. "Why don't you speak?" Still silence. The finger rose again and sliced lightly across her cheek. "All right, take her away," Kroll said when 20 minutes had passed. The Inquisitor was humming merrily, busily taping the data that had been extracted from the girl and feeding it to the main computers downstairs. They would integrate it and notify the state police. It was a smooth, functioning system. The bloody thing that had been Florence Horniman was led away by a guard, and the next prisoner led in. It was the middle-aged man, Chester Wengrove. "Get your hands off me!" he snapped to the guard as he was shoved into the room. "You have no right to—" "Unfortunately, as a representative of the state, he has every right," Kroll said calmly. He fed Wengrove's tape to the Inquisitor. The trial proceeded. Wengrove was stubborn. It took half an hour to break him down at all, but when he did speak, he sang freely, giving data on the cell of the movement. "Very good," the Inquisitor said when Wengrove finally coughed and said he knew no more. "You are completely exonerated from the charge of treason in view of the information you have given." The eyes in the bloody face lit up. "I'm free, you mean?" "Unfortunately, no," the Inquisitor said. "Because of your danger to the state, you must be kept in quarantine camp along with other diseased former members of society until such time as we are able to clear your mind of its confusion, but you will not be punished." "I won't be punished," Wengrove repeated mindlessly. "When the Inquisitor says something, it means it," Kroll said. "Take him away." The next prisoner was Neil Leslie. He strode into the Inquisitor's chamber without having to be pushed and confronted Kroll defiantly. "My turn, eh?" Kroll nodded. "Your companions have both been removed." He nodded meaningful toward the Inquisitor, whose claws were red with the blood of Florence Horniman and Chester Wengrove. They both spoke most satisfactorily, after some persuasion. "Torture, you mean?" "We've been through this already," Kroll said. "Since you're going to talk anyway, I don't understand why you can't save yourself a great deal of pain by talking now before I hand you to the Inquisitor." "Because I don't mean to talk at all," Leslie said. He ran a hand through his shock of blonde hair and glared fiercely at Kroll. "Very well," the interrogator said. He stepped to the robot and slipped in Neil Leslie's tape. "I don't understand you at all," Kroll admitted, looking down at the pain-racked body before him. "Why don't you talk? I don't want to keep you in here, you know." Bloodshot eyes looked back at him, eyes clouded with pain and hatred. "I'm not saying anything," Leslie murmured. "Oil up your robot and try again." For the 100th time, the Inquisitor's talons descended, raked a red line across the man's body. He shuddered, but did not speak. Kroll shook his head impatiently. No prisoner had ever held out against the Inquisitor this long before. He found himself perspiring. The Inquisitor said, "The name of your leader is David Cosbro. Is this true?" No answer. A needle descended. Still no answer. "Your cell was located in East Appalachia, upper quadrant. Is this true?" No answer again. Minutes passed, minutes in which Leslie continued to stare defiantly outward, continued to clench his fists and remain silent. Finally, the Inquisitor opened its tightly clamped arms and let Leslie stagger out. He slumped to the ground at the feet of the robot and leaned dazedly against the Inquisitor's gleaming base. "Prisoner is on the verge of death," the Inquisitor said. "Further questioning is pointless." Kroll looked down in surprise and chagrin. In 10 years, this was the first time a prisoner had not broken under interrogation. He scowled angrily. It was his first failure. "You're a stubborn man, Leslie, but it's killed you." "I'm not dead yet," the prisoner said brokenly. Suddenly he mustered some strength and managed to look up. "Tell me something, Kroll. I want to know something." "Yes?" "Why do you do what you do?" "You mean interrogate?" "I mean torture," Leslie said. "I'm an interrogator because it's my duty to the state. Treason must be unmasked, the enemies of the state destroyed. It is necessary." Leslie looked up, and there seemed to be pity in his eyes. "Just one question, Kroll. Doesn't it bother you when you go home? How do you know you're right and we're wrong?" Kroll started to say something, then saw there was no point in bothering. "Prisoner is dead," said the Inquisitor. "Take him away," ordered Kroll. The day was over. What Leslie had said preyed on Kroll's mind all the way home. He got out of the tube and made his way to his austere room with his mind fixed on one question, the snarling words the dying prisoner had hurled at him. How do you know you're right and we're wrong? They had to be wrong, Kroll told himself firmly. The state had to be right. It was necessary. It was logical. It was the way things had always been. But the thought obsessed him, and the image of Neil Leslie's face, bloody but undefeated, hung before him as he went about his evening's activities. The face was still in his mind as he prepared to go to bed. Odd, Kroll thought. This was the first time he had been disturbed after a torture session. He had seen hundreds, no, thousands pass through the Inquisitor, come out shambling rags of bone and flesh, and it had never bothered him, because they were enemies of the state and deserved no more. He dropped off into an uneasy sleep, but suddenly, in the small hours of the night, he sat bolt upright in bed, a cold, clammy perspiration breaking out on him. Leslie had just asked the question for the 100th time, and Kroll had had no answer. He didn't know who was right. He just didn't know. His mind, unswervingly loyal for so many years, swayed in an agony of doubt. He got out of bed and paced back and forth across the floor of his room. "The state is wrong," he said aloud. But it didn't sound right. It couldn't be true. It wasn't true. "Stupid," he told himself. It was stupid to distrust the state, and wrong. Wrong! Criminally, disgustingly wrong! There, he felt better. He had rid himself of his foolish doubts. "How could I have been so foolish?" he said aloud. His nerves felt better now. Once again he was ready to do his duty as a loyal officer of the state. Smiling to himself for being so easily disturbed by the remarks of a disloyal traitors, he climbed back into bed and closed his eyes. A few moments later he was asleep. In the morning everything seemed to be all right. The terrors of the last 12 hours were pale things of the past, no longer exerting pressure on him. He caught the tube and headed to the ministry. He donned his uniform in the locker room and took the elevator to the interrogation floor. He stepped into his office. It was empty. No prisoner this morning? It didn't seem likely. He pushed open the inner door and entered the interrogation chamber. To his surprise, he saw Matthews, one of his assistants, wearing the uniform of an interrogator, and standing near the robot, arms folded. "What are you doing in here dressed that way?" Kroll snapped. "I'm the new interrogator," Matthews told him. "Since when?" "The appointment was made very early this morning," the Inquisitor said. "We have all the evidence we need to brand you as a traitor to the state." The new interrogator turned a switch, and Kroll heard his own voice come from a speaker. "The state is wrong. Stupid. Wrong. Criminally, disgustingly wrong. How could I have been so foolish?" "There is no need to deny these words," said the interrogator. "It's only necessary that you tell us with whom you have been working." "But there's no one!" Kroll shouted. "You don't understand. I'm loyal. I can explain." But the new interrogator merely looked cold as the long, chilling metal arms of the Inquisitor reached out and gathered Kroll to his steel bosom.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Underground Movement by Alan Kim Lang, originally published in Infinity, December 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The hatch to the front compartment swung open for the first time. One man came out. He turned at once to make sure that the airtight door behind him had locked. Satisfied that it had, he turned again to look down the cabin at us. His face showed that insolence we'd learned to know as the uniform of the Bupo, the state secret police. The man from Bupo walked down the aisle between the passengers toward the rear of the car. He swept his eyes right and left like a suspecting machine, catching every detail of us on his memory. People leaned toward the walls as he approached, like children shrinking back from a big animal, and relaxed as he went by. He was out of sight in the galley at the area for a moment, then was back, carrying a pitcher of water in one hand and the key to the front compartment in the other. A battering ram hammered into my belly. I slammed, bent, hitting my head against the knees of the man sitting across from me. The capsule shuddered, smearing some obstruction against its outer wall. There was an instant when I weighed nothing. Then my head snapped back with hangman's violence as the capsule bounced forward a few meters. Then we were still. From the shock to the silence was a matter of 10 seconds. I pulled myself up from the floor. Surprisingly, my skeleton still hinged at the joints and nowhere else. The bupo man was flat in the aisle, bleeding black splotches into the green carpet. He still had hold of a piece of the water pitcher's handle. I ignored him while my brain began to push out explanations for this impossible accident. Something had gotten into the tube, that slick intestine we'd ridden through under the Andes, below the Mato Grosso, out under the Pampas. Something had got in the way of the 100 hurricanes that pushed us. The eyes and ears and unmanlike senses I'd helped build into this 5,000 kilometers of metal gut had stopped the pumps. The vacuum inviting our capsule on had filled with air, no longer tugging us to the terminal nest by the Atlantic. We were abandoned, 15 meters under God knows where. Mrs. Swaim, who knew that I'd helped in the tube's engineering, turned to me for explanation. "What happened?" she asked. "What did we hit?" The foreigner across the aisle, Mr. Rinklaven, smiled, a curious effect. "A cow on the track, I believe," he said, his voice brassy with the accent of Mars. "How did a cow get in here?" Anna demanded. She was the girl whose girlness had snagged the eyes and riled the hormones of every male in the car. "The gentleman is joking," I assured Anna. I glanced towards Surgeon General Reismazan, the man whose knees had hammered my forehead. He was clutching his right forearm, his eyes squeezed shut by pain. "What happened, Doctor?" I demanded, laying my hand on his shoulder. "Fractured my arm, my ulna. Get my case under the seat. I want to look at him." The doctor nodded towards the bupo man, who was struggling to sit up. I got out the doctor's bag. "Morphine?" I asked, finding it. "Codeine, next tray, will be plenty." I dropped 3 of the pills into Dr. Reimazan's left hand. He swallowed them without water. I used my newspaper for a splint, rolling it tight and bandaging it to the doctor's forearm. Then I hammocked the arm in a sling made of a triangular bandage. "Okay?" I asked. "You could make a fortune in orthopedics," Dr. Reimazan said. "Let's get our friend out of the aisle." I stepped out and pulled the policeman toward a sitting position. He groaned and opened his eyes. Though he'd fallen into the fragments of the broken picture, he'd suffered damage only to his dignity and his lower lip. A line of red dashes below the lip showed where his teeth had bitten through. He shook his head at our offers of tape and antiseptic and struggled to his feet. Holding the key to the front compartment before him like a dagger, he shuffled up there. He unlocked the door. Shouting something violent, he ducked into the compartment and slammed the door behind him. I lent my hands to the Surgeon General's instructions, patching up the cuts and sprains the passengers had gotten. In a moment, Miss Barry, the stewardess, took the bandages out of my hands and finished the job with fewer knots and less adhesive. The passengers sat quiet in the dim light of the capsule, as though afraid that panic might constitute a security violation. The lovely Anna pouted. Though she was unhurt herself, her precious radio was shattered. It lay under her seat, its antenna snapped like a slender idiot's neck, its electronic guts spilling from its belly. "Whatever else happens, we're rid of that puling nuisance," Don Raff growled, looking at the X radio. His mouth settled into creases, a satisfied line between parentheses. He picked up his magazine and leafed through it to prove himself superior to these chance joltings about. The lights maliciously dropped till only the bulbs at either end of the aisle were glowing. These died till they were yellow coils, magnifying the dark that was fog dust. In the top tray of my test kit was a flashlight. I broke it out to sweep the light in a quick survey of the car. Anna's eyes squinted at my beam, her mouth loose with fear for a moment, like a drawstring bag. Then she squared off, sat straight, stared defiantly into my light. Without looking down, she snapped her purse open and took a tiny automatic pistol from it. She laid this on the seat beside her, out of sight. "I've got a right to defend myself," Anna said, grim as a suffragette. I laughed out loud at this tableau of maidenhood at bay. She smoothed her hair back with both hands, making a double cantilever of her arms to lift her breasts, demonstrating the noble architecture of woman, mocking me. I stopped laughing. I jumped the beam over her to help Miss Barry break out the emergency lights. Those lamps were lit, and glowed in the cabin with a chilly blue light. Mrs. Swaim asked of the woman beside her, as though it was an afterthought, "Why did we stop?" "I don't know," Mrs. Grimm admitted. I knew her. She was the wife of the Minister of Agriculture, a man who'd acquired a reputation for integrity in a government that didn't use the word. For me, the tube has always been just a link between home and Albert's office at Bayer. I didn't think that link could break. Miss Barry was knocking at the door up front. It opened a reluctant inch to show the eyes of the Bupo cop. He growled some answer to the stewardess's question, then slammed and relocked his door. Miss Barry hurried back to me. "A man was pulled out of that compartment," she said. "He unlocked the entry hatch and was blown out into the tube by cabin pressure." "Like a beetle blasted off a bush by the garden hose," Don Raff murmured. "I expect my baggage is strung out from here to Havana," Anna pouted. "Doesn't the state have regulations to keep prisoners from killing themselves on public property?" "Suicide?" Mrs. Swaim asked, soft as a prayer. "Must have been," Don Raff snapped. He twisted his magazine into a club, underlining his words with thumps against his open palm. "Some weakling not worthy to stand with us in war, he was. A conscientious objector, probably." Don Raff said, "Conscientious objector," exactly as he had said the name of a sexual perversion. "We're all going to the capital on the leader's business. Some of us have been called to the leader's actual presence." He glowed pride, giving his secret away. "There is no place in the leader's new society for weaklings. They are better where this one is, underground, dead." "Many of us are pained by the thought of war," the Martian said. "Not in the pain of weakness, but that of pity for men lost in battle who might have grown strong in peace." "A peacemonger!" Don Raff's was the tone of a Puritan finding a red zucchetto under his pastor's hat. "Surely you don't expect our leader to bear forever the insults of the Yellow Confederacy?" "Of course." Don Raff's eyes widened in anticipation of delicious violence. "You men from Mars are yellow too." The foreigner, whose skin was in fact the colour of lemon peel, smiled and made no comment. "I wish you men wouldn't talk so much about war," Mrs. Swaim broke in. "Talking about ugly things just helps them to happen. Raphael, my boy, is in the Continental Guard. He says we'll have no war. He says that the Confederacy is too afraid of our air power to risk a war. Raphael is a flyer." "Of course," Don Raff smiled, his smile not reaching up to his eyes. "The Yellow Confederacy is so afraid of our flying defenders that we're forced to travel like moles so as not to confuse our own radar guns. Our skies are closed to us. Everything that flies across the two continents, from Tierra del Fuego to Medicine Hat, is shot from the air as an enemy. We must take to these caves for a 10-hour trip. 10 hours for a capsule to be blown from Bogota to the coast, a trip a rocket could clip off in minutes. That's why our leader will take us to war, to get back the freedom of our own blue skies." Don Raff finished, a little breathless. "I wonder who the poor man was," Mrs. Swamer said, ignoring him. Miss Barry shook her head, wondering the same thing. Without saying anything, she went back to the galley to call a surface station on the capsule's radio telephone. While she was back there, Miss Barry took a lamp and peered through the glass window in the rear hatch. She saw what becomes of a man caught between a pistoning capsule and its tube. After being sick, she came to tell us that the surface station had determined that we were just east of the village of Rabanan. My mental map of the route the tube followed showed Rabanan as a dot 15 kilometers from the nearest exit hatch. Miss Barry smiled on courage. "A rescue party will be here before long," she assured the others. "Would anyone care for sandwiches or coffee while we wait?" Her stomach must have cringed at the thought. "Tea would be nice," Mr. Rinclaven volunteered. Then he realized his blunder. Tea came from Confederacy countries. "I mean coffee, of course," he said. "I'll help you get it ready," Mrs. Grimm said to Miss Barry. "Oh, no," the hostess protested, without much conviction in her voice. Mrs. Grimm smiled and led the way back to the galley. In a moment she had the water for our coffee steaming on the chemical burner. The stewardess, meanwhile, was smearing the currant butter substitute on slivers of bread and arranging the buttered triangles into Maltese crosses on our plates. Thus Miss Barry brought us tiffin. The Martian took his coffee black. He sat looking into it as he sipped, as though apologizing for his alien presence. Mrs. Swamer, more practiced than the rest of us in this act of informal reflection, took a slice of bread and a cup of sugar-thick coffee and talked. She steered clear of the grim topics around us, turning her attention instead to Mr. Rinclaven, who sparkled back at her like a grateful mirror. "Is this your first visit to Earth?" she asked him. "No, indeed. I spent several years at your excellent university at Sao Paulo," the yellow man said. "That was some time ago, of course." He refrained from saying just how long ago. The Martian lifespan makes humanity's scant 70 look feeble. The Surgeon General asked me quietly, "Why exactly are we held here?" "As long as the body is back there, the pumps can't run. Safety devices prevent the capsule from moving so long as there's a foreign body in the tube." I stopped, suddenly aware of my clumsy, accidental pun. "All right," Dr. Reimerson said. "We'll have to move the corpse into the capsule and take it to Bayer with us." "It will be the worst sort of job," I said. "If the repair crew takes more than a day, we're in for trouble anyway." He was right. This was February, our hottest month. "You have a strong stomach?" he asked. "No." I hurried forward to tell Miss Barry of our decision. She gave us a lamp and a blanket, and phoned the surface to tell them what we were doing. The doctor and I locked the airtight door of the galley behind us. At this end of the capsule, there was a second airtight hatch, exactly like that in front, the one the body had hurtled through. At its middle, like a glass navel, was a dial showing the pressure outside. It read 975 millibars. I spun the wheel to unlock the door from its frame, stubbornly resisting the temptation to anticipate through the window, to see what waited us out there. The hatch swung out. I turned the lamplight on the walls outside. It was bad. The tube was bulged at the top a little way back, like a vein about to rupture. Its surface was smeared with red. It smelled like a place where they slaughtered chickens. The body lay about 20 meters back. I took the blanket from Dr. Reimerson and walked back along the slippery shaft, trying to dull my eyes and nose to what I was about to do. The doctor, one arm trussed to his chest by my crude sling, could lend me only moral support. I looked down at the corpse. One arm had been torn off at the shoulder and was held to the body by the handcuffs between the wrists. The man had been cut and burned and broken before he'd thrown himself out the capsule. I rolled the thing into the blanket and dragged it behind me to the capsule. It took 10 minutes for me to force it through the hatch. Inside, we rolled the body under the galley sink, then washed our shoes and ourselves. We dogged the hatch shut and phoned topside, telling them to let the winds take hold again. As we made ready to go back into the cabin, the light of my lamp glinted off a bit of metal lying on the floor. It had fallen from a horrible package under the sink. Dr. Reimazan picked it up. He held it near the lamp, examining it. He was going to say something to me when the door to the cabin, which we'd unlocked, burst open. "What in the hell's name are you doing?" the Bupo man demanded. "We've cleared the tube," I said very softly, shoving before his face the card that showed with my face and fingerprints that I was a tube engineer. The Surgeon General stared at the policeman as though he was something wet and stinking from a swamp. "Who was the man who jumped from your compartment?" the doctor asked. "State business," the Bupo snapped. "Keep your mouth shut." Too late, he recognized the Surgeon General's uniform and became silent. "Watch your long tongue," Dr. Reimazan growled. "I have an audience with a leader. You may find yourself envying the poor devil under the sink his blanket." The Bupo, wavering between anger and apology, settled on an attitude of injured dignity. He turned and stalked down the aisle toward his private cabin up front. I followed him with my eyes, memorizing him. In case I should ever meet him again, I wanted to complete wrecking his face where the accident had left off. The capsule jumped onto its plunger of wind. Only the brilliance of the ceiling lights showed that we were again flashing toward the coast and the capital. I sat beside the Surgeon General. "What was it that you picked up back there?" I asked him. He handed me the thing. It was a Medal of Honor. Its ribbon was a scrap of silk, and the medal itself was bent as though it had been clamped in a vice and hammered. Turning it over, I read the engraved legend through a smear of blood. "To Dr. Noah Reimazan, for devotion to his profession, his people, and his leader." A curt congratulation, I thought. After a moment I asked, "A brother?" "My oldest son. He saved hundreds in the ruins of Managua, in the plague that followed the revolution there." Dr. Reimazan took the medal from me and sat rocking back and forth, staring at the laurel-garnished star in his hand. "Why did they kill him?" he asked. "It wasn't suicide. It was escape. You saw what they'd done to him with their little knives, their pliers and electrodes. Noah was a hero, set by imperial order on a pedestal. He looked directly at the leader, man to man, his physician. He wasn't as strong as I am, this son of mine. Noah couldn't watch men killed for their ideas, defending his silence with the argument that he was a doctor, set somewhere above grubby politics." Dr. Reimazan's voice was loud enough that anyone in the car who wished could have heard him. "Your son died for talking plain," I whispered to the doctor. We sat in silence. The capital of the leader of our hemisphere was only an hour away. After a moment, the Surgeon General sat straight. He brushed his uniform with his left hand and smoothed the sling under his right arm. Then he crossed the aisle to the seat where Anna sat. I stared at him. "Do you mind if I sit beside you?" He smiled down at the girl, as gallant as though we were at a military ball. "As you wish, General," Anna answered. She was pleased, I saw, that a man with such a uniform and such position should notice her. The doctor talked to Anna the way a pretty girl expects to be talked to, emphasizing what he was saying by an occasional avuncular pat. After a while, Anna grew a little bored with a playmate who was older than her father. As the car began to slow, caught by resistance coils in the walls of the tube, I saw the Surgeon General pat the girl playfully one more and pick up something she had laid beside her in the darkness. She didn't notice. We halted on the shores of the Bay of All Saints, Bahia, the capital. We saw no more of the Bupo man, since his compartment held the exit hatch. He was out first, scurrying somewhere with the news of Noah Reimazan's suicide, news which would either lift him a notch in his profession or push his head onto the chopping block. The rest of us lined up, passed through the front compartment, out onto the platform. The station sparkled like a diamond tiara, glittering with slogans and brass and reminders that we'd reached the greatest city on our half of the world. A grey sedan stood on the ramp, waiting for those the leader had singled out for audience. Its door bore those interlocked commas, the yin-yang symbol that the leader had taken from the enemy to make his cipher. Dr. Rein nodded goodbye to me. Accompanied by Don Raff, he walked over to the Imperial limousine. The Surgeon General replied to the salutes of the bodyguards with his left hand, turning aside their references to his injury with a grin. The doors slammed shut, and the sedan roared off, carrying Don Raff and the Surgeon General Raimazan to meet the leader, and carrying, under the doctor's sling, the little pistol I'd seen him steal from Anna.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
And There Was Light by Lester del Rey. Originally published in Future Combined with Science Fiction Stories, July 1951. Narrated by Tom Trussel. When the enemy believes the worst of you, they won't settle for anything except the worst. Volchek believed his weapon would be humane and less destructive than the dreaded fusion bombs. Stephanie was still white and weak, but the worry on her face had nothing to do with her recent sickness as she rushed about the small, crudely furnished apartment, trying to appear normal. Johann Volchek studied his young wife, worrying more about her than the meeting for the moment. If the child had only lived. Then he smiled a bit ironically, before letting his mind come up with the old palliatives. There'd be other children for him and Stephanie, and for this half of this world. The other half would simply have to suffer painlessly through a generation, for the good of the whole world. "But the director, Johann!" Stephanie's voice was on the thinnest edge of hysteria. "Johann, to our place! If I'd known I could have made curtains at least, and can you be sure?" "It isn't suspicion, Radost Moja," he assured her quickly. "I told you the director trusts me. He has to, and he simply wants to see you. You know he's a family man himself." But he let her work, fussing about the place, refilling his coffee, brushing an imaginary speck of dust off his coat. The doctor had told him that work was best for her, anything to get her mind off the lost child until there could be others. And the director may have been a better distraction than any of the others, aside from the flattery of it. Then the telephone on the wall rang sharply, and he answered it, smiling back at her. "Volchek." "Good, Johann." It was the director's Secretary of Science, Jean Petrecci, and Volchek's sponsor. "We shall be there soon, and it's a beautiful day for the test, not so?" Johann agreed quickly, though he had not yet had time to look through the windows even, with Stephanie's worry of the visit of the director. But as he looked out now, he saw that it was a good day, clear, with only thin wisps of cloud in the sky. Then, in the street below, there was a stirring, first of big cars, then the shouts of the people. It was silenced, and the creaking elevator began to thump upwards. Stephanie made a last frantic dash into the bedroom, brushing nervously at her hair, and came out just as the knock sounded. Johann had been right. The director must have trusted him, since the big man had come up with only 3 of his guards, and now came thrusting his broad shoulders in, his greyed head not even darting about the room, his eyes leading him towards the Volcheks. Quick admiration filled his eyes at sight of Stephanie, and his gruff voice was soft, the voice the radio brought them when he was the father of the state, or when he was telling them of the new plans for more food and better living. "Sit. I'm only one of you, you know. Ah, Johann, this is the little Stephanie. I've wanted to meet you, to see the one Johann has spoken of so often. His language was perfect, but with the queer, stilted effect it always had when he was not reading a prepared speech. Watching Stephanie stammer over the honor of the director's presence, and then relax gradually as the spell of the man took over, Johann began to smile more naturally. The director was talking of his own beginnings in much less than this, and the moving they would soon be doing into a newer apartment, a fine new suburb, and surprisingly, he was talking of his own wife and children, and Stephanie was answering. Remembering stories of the director, Johann found it hard to recognize this as reality. The man had come up from the lowest ranks, an iron hand leading him up the ladder of Centralia's autocratic bureaucracy. But now the hand was sheathed, and even Stephanie began to smile. Then it was over, and the director was rising. Johann kissed his wife quickly, embarrassed slightly at the director's approving smile, and they were out in the elevator, heading towards the big waiting cars. "Now I trust you, Johann Volchek," the director told him. "Now I can go with you to this test. With such a wife waiting you, there can be no trickery against the state. No, don't say it. It is not you I could distrust. It is everyone I must distrust. But not now. What does the doctor say? Another year." For a time they had been afraid that Stephanie could never have children again, but the new treatments had apparently been effective. Centralia's progress in all phases of gynecology had been spectacular. The director nodded. "Good. The state needs such children as you will have, and a man has need of little ones. But tell me, you still feel sure of this test?" Then the talk became technical. Johann was sure. There had been smaller tests during the 2 years the project had been going on, and all of them had been effective. Then cold fingers ran over him, tingling at the ends of his nerves as he realized the trick semantics were playing on him. Test. It had been the name they had given it, and in time it had come to be no more than that in his mind. A test of his theories. But it was not just a test. This was the feat itself. The step that would bring an end to half the world, the culmination of the hopes of Centralia, and the final positive proof of the ideas of Volchek. He had been almost unaware of the power that had grown from his idea, but now it hit him. It wasn't easy to do that to half a world, even in these days, but it had to be done. 30 years before, there had been a sprawling group of small nations and several large powers. But with the beginning of the atomic age, that had shaken itself down until now there were actually only the 2 hemispheres. Centralia had most of the world's population, but the West had achieved equality by its head start in the sciences and in industry. For 30 years, little nation had accreted to big nation, until now there were the 2 of them. Nominally, the little nation still existed, but it was a polite fiction, like the fiction of bland softness the director had adopted before Stephanie. And this was not a world where 2 powers could exist. They had somehow achieved it, while the accretion of control of the neighboring states went on. There had been fracas piled onto struggle, but never outright war. Now, though, things had reached a stage where each side knew that sooner or later the hydrogen bombs must fall, and where those bombs were of a size and efficiency that might even end the world. There were even rumors of solar phoenix bombs which could turn the world into a flaming lesser sun. Volchek sighed. This was better than that. Better that half the world should slow down and come to a gradual halt, than that the rain of hell should descend from the heavens, perhaps igniting the world itself. They were at the laboratories now, and Volchek got out of the car behind the director, vaguely conscious that taking second place was a mark of honor. Inside the building, one of the rooms had been cleared, leaving a few seats, a stand, and a single board of levers against the wall. Already the seats were taken, and men were rising to salute the director. Kifong, Tamatsu, Bandaputra, Simonolov, Schwarzkopf, Georgeson, all of the big names of government and science, were there. Some were scowling intently as they tried to digest the printed formulae on the big blackboard which gave part of the theory behind Volchek's work. Others were smiling, assured only that this was the day when Centralia would come into its own. And some, as always, were estimating Volchek, wondering how his importance would conflict with their own. The director smiled thinly, dropping an arm over Volchek's shoulder. "After this day, Johann, you'll need bodyguards. I have seen to that. And Petrecci, well, we shall see." Johann caught himself before he could wince. He'd liked Petrecci, had no desire to replace him. But if the implication of the director's words was what he thought, still, it would be good for Stephanie. She had had too much trouble, and it was time life smiled on her a little. It would be good for their children, too, to grow up with comfort, even a little luxury, tutored perhaps with the children of the director himself. As Secretary of Science, Johann Volchek would give his family a great deal. He caught Petrecci's eyes on him, and turned his head quickly back to the other men. At the director's nod, he began outlining the facts to them. Some already knew of what was being done here, but all were listening as if the director himself were speaking. He could only give the barest facts. He had been experimenting with a means of controlling fission for some power application, working on the problem of getting hydrogen to fission at temperatures below the millions of degrees where it normally began, and in tiny amounts. And by sheer accident, he had stumbled upon a process where nitrogen fissioned instead. 2 atoms of nitrogen combining into one, straining the nucleus that now held 14 protons and 14 neutrons, distorting it until some of the binding force of the nucleus released energy, and it broke up into simpler atoms again, as if both fission and fusion were going on. It had not been successful from a commercial angle, but it had produced an unexpected result. The mice which had been kept to test out danger of radiation had not been killed, but they had been sterile, as events proved from then on. The release of radiation was not quite normal gamma rays. It was subtler than that, some queerly polarized radiation that struck at the fertility of animals and ended it. "But you were not sterilized," Qi Feng interrupted him. "I was lucky. I had been using a shield that was heavy enough to turn aside the radiation. The 4-foot walls of the oven where the experiment was conducted. It only leaked out through the panel we later found had a crack in it. But that was toward the mice. 3 years had been spent in testing it on mice before the reports had found Petrecci and brought him to the little laboratory of Johann Volchek. By then, Volchek had developed a complete control of the process and had learned to fuse and fission oxygen as well as nitrogen, but without the production of sterilizing radiation this time. After that, there had been no more mice." Volchek shuddered, trying to conceal it, as he remembered the prisoners who had stood before the portal of the oven and gone away sterile. And there had been tests in the big deserted wastes near the Gobi, where balls of fire had leapt from his tiny little devices and cracked themselves into flaming energy that grew and spread before vanishing. More sterility had followed. "It requires very little apparatus," Volchek said finally. He pulled a small tube from a drawer near the wall and held it out to them. "This is the source. A small battery, these coils, tubes, this little crucible, nothing more. Once we knew why it started the fusion, it was easy to simplify." And it was simple. A man could carry one of the devices with him in a small bag, and it was meaningless in appearance. It could be built into a radio, as if it were part of the tuning device. It could slip past customs, harmless in its looks, and be spread wherever wanted. And now... The director took over, then, telling them what had already been done. In every city and hamlet, from coast to coast and from polar cap to polar cap, the West was covered with these tiny little devices, each equipped with a little crystal delicately attuned to one hair, so that they would all function at once. There would be no war. Centralia had laboured to avoid war in spite of the hatred and lusts of the West. Now they would be even more agreeable, even more meek. They would take the insults. They would not fight. Because, once the nitrogen of the air had done its job, there would be only a generation of patience, while no more children were born to the West. And some day there would be only one power, Centralia. Schwarzkopf asked the question that was bothering the others, though we already knew the answer. But these balls of fissioning or fusioning nitrogen, when they go off over in the West, they are too much like atomic bombs. Won't the West feel it's attacked and retaliate with their genuine bombs? We too shall be attacked. It was Volchek's other process, of course. Simultaneously, there would be released similar bombs all over the territory of Centralia. The heat and power would do a minor amount of damage, of course, but this process produced no sterilizing radiation. Only New Zealand will be free. New Zealand had somehow held out of the two coalitions by its hardest efforts and with the help of its location. It was weakly allied to the West, but too remote. The director smiled again, the tight smile that was reserved for private meetings. We shall, of course, accuse the West, but within the hour, when word of their trouble comes, we shall ask for a truce to find the culprit. Simple, is it not? The clock on the wall indicated 5 minutes before 0 hour, and Volchek wiped his hands surreptitiously against his coat. It was simple enough, this use to which they had put his discoveries, and, he told himself again, it was better than any reign of real atomics. The West would not be hurt seriously. It would simply die out slowly, as no more children were born. It was really the most merciful solution to the politics of this world. He could picture some of the panic, of course, when the little tubes did their work. First a tiny spark would form in the tube, with a spitting and hissing. Then it would grow, breaking out of the tube and through walls or anything in its way, growing and rising, spreading erratically horizontally, moving with a strange random motion as it climbed upwards and grew larger and larger. It would reach the size of a normal atomic bomb in a few minutes, and some would be killed by its heat, as some buildings would catch fire from it. But mostly there would be the terror, as the people in the cities saw it spread its visible radiation and heard the familiar crackling thunder of its detonation. The terror would kill some of them in their panic flight, even while the thing itself drifted upwards until it found a layer of air too thin for it to go on, and it came to an automatic end. But they would mostly escape, except for bad cases of sunburn and the result of their own panic. Dry material flamed quickly before its peculiar radiation, but men were not made of dry material, and it was almost harmless. They would simply have no children, and that was better than most of them could expect in a day when each morning marked the beginning of a new fear of hydrogen bombs, or worse. 1 more minute. Volchek had expected the director to move to the panel where the big switch would cut on the surprisingly small oscillator that would trigger the little crystals in the tube projectors. But the director was stepping back, motioning him forward. You, Johann, it is an honor I have reserved for you. There was silence in the laboratory room as Volchek moved slowly toward the board. He straightened, his eyes going down to his coat, where a bit of lint clung to it. Stephanie would have spotted it at once and rushed to brush it off. Stephanie, who knew nothing of what his great work was, but who was awed by having a husband who could receive a visit from the director. Stephanie, who could have other children, after all, in this world that would have ultimate peace in spite of all the war threats, because of the work her husband was now about to do. Suddenly, he wondered how many Stephanies there might be in the West. How many women would wait for the children they wanted and never find them? How many would curse him when they finally realized the truth without ever knowing that he was the man they were cursing? He cut off the thought savagely. There would be others in the long centuries to come who would know his name and would then bless him as their children grew up without the threat of war and extinction. His children would be proud of him, his and Stephanie's. He touched the switch that was to set off the harmless fake bombs over their own world first. The director was at his side, his face no longer smiling, but narrowed to that of a wolf. Then the director chuckled, and the edge of his lips curled up. "Let there be light," he quoted, and his eyes showed that he knew the original usage of the term in the book he was quoting. And there was light, as Johann's finger hit the switch. A tiny, spitting, hissing thing lifted from the nearby city, going up and forward in weird, erratic movements, growing larger and spreading out, now beginning the muttered staccato thunder that was not unlike a plutonium bomb. The director reached over and pressed the other switch that would send the sterilizing bombs up over the west, but he did not depress it fully. He stopped and nodded to Volchek, and again Johann's hand went out, pushing the lever of the switch. He should have brought Stephanie. If only she could have known nothing of the results. She would have been proud of him then, as the director solemnly shook the hand that had done its work, and the other men began to cluster around him. Then they moved towards the windows, hesitantly at first, not quite sure that this fire in the heavens over the city beyond was really the safe kind. But the director led them, together with Volchek, and they stood gazing out. It was a huge ball of blazing fire in the sky now, partially softened by the filters that had sprung shut over the windows automatically, and the mutter of its detonation reached them as they stood there. There was some damage, of course, even here. Some of the older wooden buildings near where it had first appeared were bursting into flames, and the distant figures of people had gone into a panic. They had to believe it was real, just as the West must believe for a time that both powers had received the same treatment. Stephanie, but Volchek had taken care of that with a drug in her coffee. She would be asleep, unaware of the tumult, and not one of the mob trying frantically to escape what could never harm them. Now the ball of fire was rising upwards more steadily, its own heat driving it up as a blast of hot air is carried up over a fire. The brightness began to fade as they watched, moving up and turning smaller, shrinking, and finally going away. Volchek sighed, and the director echoed it, a satisfied sigh, and a somewhat regretful one. "It is hard to see even a few of my people hurting themselves," the director said slowly, "but it is best, and it is done." He turned to Volchek, and Johann straightened, reminding himself that whatever the director said must be remembered. He would have to tell Stephanie, and some day he could tell his children and his grandchildren. He must remember it. But the director's words were never spoken. There was a shout from the windows, and they swung back to see another tiny flame leaping up, this time nearer, growing and spitting. There was something wrong with it. The others had grown more slowly. This raged out, savagely, growing more sure of itself as it leapt toward them, then darted sidewise. Volchek turned suddenly to the instruments packed in the drawers. The spectrovisor and the diffractograph came out in his shaking hands, and he slapped them down onto the wooden sill of the window, already beginning to smoke faintly. Then his hand steadied as he adjusted the instruments. One look was enough. This was the nitrogen fusion, not the harmless oxygen reaction. His eyes met the director's, and he nodded, but the nod was unnecessary. The director had already guessed. They moved toward him, a harsh mob sound coming from them, but the director was before them. "No, stop!" The voice that had been trained to command a power greater than men had ever held before stopped them. "No, if the West has scientists too. That is no fault of Johann Wolczek. Johann, you did not fail. You will not suffer. Wolczek heard him and saw them fall back. He thought again of the lint on his coat and looked down at it. He picked it off while the others drew back, and the director was assuring him that all would be well with him. Stephanie would have no children now. There would be no grandchildren to hear the director's senseless words, telling him he would not suffer. You don't suffer when you've killed a race.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. Who knows? You might like the next one even better.